Today's guest is David M. Kane. David is a self-employed investor and entrepreneur. He's 41. He's single with no kids. He's a catch, ladies. He has lived a clean and sober lifestyle for a decade now, and he's actually a close friend and colleague of mine. We've kind of worked together on some marketing things, and he has been a client of mine for quite some time, probably. I think he came to see me during a meditation course I was teaching at some point. That was a long time ago when I was still mainly focusing on Reiki and meditation. So it's really a pleasure to be able to have David come on the show and share where he's at. And I think we're probably primarily going to be focusing on a physical issue that David's been experiencing of problems like knee pain and stuff like that. So I think David has an extensive background in PS Tech now because I've been kind of drilling it into him for years, and he's done the work. So welcome, David. It's good to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
And why don't you share a little bit about, like, how long have you been working with PS Tech? What kind of results have you seen so far with it?
So I've been using it since you introduced me to it. So since about early 2016. And first off, I was sort of a slow implementer, right? I tried it and it worked and I got a result. Yet for some reason, I was still sort of slow to use it regularly. So around like March 2016, I was using it, I'd say like once every 2 weeks. I was mindful of sort of the one side effect that I experienced with it was headaches, and that's something I have. Migraine headaches is a condition I live with. So I think that sort of made me a little leery initially. And then once I found a rhythm with it, once I sort of got over that initial hump, became a regular user of the Click Track 2 program and saw pretty much immediate results with it.
That's awesome. Good. Can you share maybe an example or two of what specific things you've seen change in your life with it?
Yep. So with the Click Track 2 program, it was going through a lot of things from my past, right? So painful memories, recurring thoughts, things of that nature. Um, and sort of two main things jump out for sort of the case study aspect of it. One was just going through and clearing a whole bunch of sort of run-of-the-mill memories, just things that keep firing as a thought over and over and over, things that, it's sort of like your brain doesn't really know what to do with it. It's just sort of this random unprocessed memory that just sort of nags on and on and on. And where I started with it was sort of the low-hanging fruit of things that were just recurring, right? So not particularly painful or traumatic things, just, sort of nagging things. And once those disappeared, that was what sort of gave me the momentum to try something more serious. And then the most impactful experience I had with it was clearing a memory from my first romantic relationship. So it's a memory that, occurred when I was 15 and a half years old. And in sitting, I can remember the entire experience, right? So I know exactly where I was sitting. I know exactly what I was doing. In clearing that set of painful memories, it was an experience that led to sort of like a physiological response, right? So I was sitting there, finished the track, and sort of exhaled, and I could like feel it was like a knot in my chest being released. So it was like sternum area. I just feel the release, and it was in that instant I could tell it was like my self-esteem shifted. And so uh, as someone who's a little bit more maybe grounded and kind of logic driven, having that kind of experience, I immediately was thinking like, okay, my self-esteem is not a place in my body. It's not an organ. It's not a muscle. Like, sort of, what was this really? And yeah, just sort of checking in with myself, I could tell like, no, that's what it was. It was, not, it wasn't a muscle tension. It wasn't a pre-existing thing. I didn't have a long-standing, physical issue with tension around my sternum or anything like that. But I could tell that just being free of that weight in sort of its complexity of the memory, but then how it affects self-esteem and sort of how one internalizes, negative thoughts as a result of something that happens. Being free of all that was something that, yeah, I mean, it was sort of this immediate experience. I felt like my self-esteem changed by like, 10% in that one single moment. The visual for it is, I always think of the Dr. Seuss adage about the Grinch's heart growing three sizes, right? So
Yeah.
it's sort of this, random and sort of non-physical aspect that was experienced so profoundly that, that was really the icing on the cake. I was already a believer at that point, but that's really what drove home just how impactful this can be for, I'll just say, sort of the long-standing things that we all accumulate over the years.
Yeah, definitely. And that's really the experience that I've had with it too. It's incredible what it can unravel.
Agreed.
You also went through like maybe a year or so where you really bore down on this. Like you were doing rounds every single day, correct?
Yes. So I forget off the top of my head where the streak topped out at. I know it was triple digits. Off the top of my head, I'd say like 120, 130 days, something like that. Um, and part of what helped me sort of find my stride with that streak was after I had done the Click Track 2 program, and again, sort of intermittently to begin with, once I had sort of cleared the initial list of painful memories, it then became working on more of the belief orientated things for past, present, and future timeframes of, um, you know, really the belief blasters and positive quantum turbo. And that I found much more sustainable as an everyday practice. I was not getting any headaches as a side effect. I had a laundry list of things a mile long that were just easy to sort of zap, every day. And at 10 minutes a pop, I just made sure I had that time as part of my regular routine. So it was usually first thing in the morning. And yeah, it was fantastic. And I feel like that's where you get into a little bit of what's referred to as a flywheel effect, right? So the momentum keeps going and you keep want to doing it and you find yourself getting that little bit freer, a little bit freer, a little bit freer.
Yeah, good for you. That's great.
I,
So what you came to talk about today was some physical issues you've been having. So why don't you give some background on that? Like, what have you been experiencing, and what would you like to work on about that?
yep. So I've had bad knees since middle school, right? Just playing sports, soccer, baseball, stuff like that. And so I'm used to sort of residual knee pain for a lot of my 20s and 30s. I would take supplements like joint supplements, and that got me a lot of sort of wiggle room and leeway in terms of mobility, no pain during everyday encounters, stuff like that. And then now hitting middle age, um, that's changing a little bit. And then in terms of lower legs and my feet, things like that, there's some pain, some issues. And so where I'm at with it is, there are things I can do medically and in terms of like nutrition and things like that. But in terms of the mental aspects, I'm curious about sort of where the limits are for treating a physical condition in terms of anything that might benefit the actual physical symptoms. And then mentally, this whole coinciding of middle age and decreased mobility has kind of flared up a whole bunch of stuff, and it kind of opens the door to one of the big recurring thoughts that's really hit me with this is, I have no idea what's normal, right? I have no idea what's normal for middle-aged aches and pains versus, a separate condition and things like that.
Yeah, and I think really what's normal for middle age really depends on what your history is in particular, because for me, it has not been normal to have debilitating knee pain, but I have not had knee problems since middle school. So, it's a little difficult to, to define exactly what it's going to feel like for each individual when they reach middle age. And of course, like you mentioned, you can do things nutritionally and all of that, and cutting out whatever you can that's inflammatory, and going that route on the physical level. But it's an interesting question to look at physical issues with PS Tech in general, because I have had some hit or miss experiences myself with using it on physical stuff. Now, he says that you can use it on physical pain. So you very well could just feel the knee pain, experience the knee pain, and click track that and see where that gets you.
Okay.
Because he, does say that if you can convince the subconscious mind that that pain isn't there, it's not there. And so it basically, even though the click tracks are primarily designed for emotions, it can also be effective on physical pain. I've seen it work on some people. I've seen it not work on other people. So
Okay.
it's really just something you kind of have to try out and see whether that really clicks for you or not. And I think for a lot of people, just the experience of having had PS Tech work on a lot of other things for you will give you a little bit of an additional kick in the susceptibility to being able
Yeah.
to have it work on other things. Now, for me, I've seen it work super well on preventing illness. So I have prevented so many colds by catching it that day, the day where you're not quite sick yet, but you're starting to feel kind of icky, your glands are swollen, and you're feeling a little sinusy and maybe starting to feel a little run down. And you just know, like, tomorrow you're going to be sick as a dog. So if you can catch it that day and
Okay.
usually I do about 2 or 3 rounds over the course of that day of the click track. And I just feel the symptoms. I, feel the swollen glands. I feel the sinus pressure. I feel the inner ear pressure. I feel the tiredness. And I just acknowledge that I feel like I'm getting sick and how much I hate getting sick. And then I go back to the symptoms, and I just kind of continue looping on that throughout the round. And usually if I do like 2 or 3 rounds that day, the next day I wake up and I'm fine, when I normally would have woken up with a really bad cold. It often doesn't like fix it in the moment. So you might still continue sort of feeling a little off for the rest of that day. But normally, like by the next morning, you're back to normal and feeling fine again when you normally would have been sick. And I've seen that work for a lot of people. Once again, doesn't do it for every single person, but the majority of people that I've recommended it to have had good luck with doing that. But something physical that I've used it on that wasn't successful yet uh, is Restless Legs.
Okay.
So when I was going through my divorce and all of the unwanted stuff and all of that, I had like a few years in a row where I was really, really stressed out. And during that period of time is when the Restless Legs developed. And, on like a metaphysical or spiritual level, the belief is that restless legs have to do with your body's trying to tell you to get out of a situation, but you're not allowing yourself to leave that situation. And that's really what was going on. It was just this sense of like, I knew in my heart that I wanted to, get out of the marriage that I was in, but I wasn't ready to do that until I had kind of had some major realizations that it was actually crueler to stay and try to make things work when my heart wasn't in it. So during that transition, my legs started to try to leave, even though my body would not leave. My brain was like, no, we can't leave yet. So I've had it kind of off and on ever since then. And it actually, after a car accident where my knee got bent backwards, I had mostly gotten it under control. And then that brought it all roaring back. And so for the last few years, I've been dealing with it still. And I can control it mainly with nutritional stuff and doing the proper amount of exercise and massage and all of that kind of stuff. But I have tried using PS Tech on the Restless Legs, and I've tried using like EFT tapping on it, and everything seems to work for like a day or two, but then, it just comes right back. And I don't know what it is that I'm missing that hasn't allowed me to completely and totally obliterate it. And something else funny that I've noticed is when I've done hypnosis on it, telling my brain over and over again, like, that's not a thing anymore and it's just going away and blah, 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 it gets worse. So now I would assume, because of my experience with other modalities, that it's about working through layers. So probably if I were to keep going with it, if I were to keep listening night after night after night after night and keep putting up with it for whatever period of time it would take for it to work out through the layers, that eventually it probably would clear it and remove it. But am I willing to lose who knows how many nights of sleep in order to get to that place? I don't know. So really, I just kind of continue spot treating it in the moment when it arises and kind of try to take care of it that way. So I have seen it work really well on some physical pain. I've seen it work really well on, colds, or even like if you eat something bad and you know that your stomach is gonna, like you can use it on that. So things of that nature, it's really beneficial for, but with other physical issues, it can be hit or miss. So really the better way to address things like that is to look at what are the emotions kind of underlying those issues, or what are the beliefs that you have about those issues um, that need to be addressed. And honestly, I mean, regardless of whether it cures the physical issue or not, addressing whatever emotions or beliefs around that are perpetuating it can be beneficial in other areas of your life too. So, it certainly can't hurt to address it from as many angles as possible.
Yeah, there are two thoughts that come to mind real quick, just sort of hearing you walk through all that. So with all of the painful memory and belief orientated things, sort of one of the sort of, taglines or, claims for everything PSEC related is that it gets you off of the sort of whack-a-mole treadmill of this is a way to resolve things at an emotional level, for all time in, 1, 2, 3 rounds. It's interesting that for physical things, in terms of the actual physical pain, it may be a little bit more of a whack-a-mole, do it to sort of buy yourself a day or two, and for sort of a crunch time thing where it's worth trading 10, 20 minutes for a day or two, that might be worth it. And that actually is in line with an experience I had previously. I think you and I have talked about it, for migraine headaches. I've gotten a result for like a day or two, and that was about it. But there may be some practical use there. And then in terms of the emotional aspects, that's the part where I sort of traditionally see the benefit, and with this particular set of issues. I mean, all the notions of, you know, middle age and what's normal versus, you know, sort of the thoughts of restricted mobility in terms of time per day, you know, walking, standing, doing different activities, and then, you know, sort of larger life impact of, you know, sort of those moments of those sort of thoughts of sort of admittedly the almost melodramatic thoughts of like, oh, what does this mean for travel and things like that. You know, just being free of those broken record thoughts always has value for me. You know, the whole notion of just freeing up the thinking time to just not have those thoughts anymore is always of value.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, like as you were talking, I kind of came up with a few beliefs that you might benefit from clearing. Just the very simple, straightforward belief of I had the belief that I had bad knees.
Yeah, and that's a belief I've had for, I can't even do the math, like 26 years or whatever it is.
Right.
More.
And
Yeah.
and so, you know, believing that welcomes more of that, can create more of that, can create the expectation of more of that. And so I think, you know, just hitting that very direct, simple belief can be beneficial. Another one was I had the belief that bodies deteriorated more as we aged, or that bodies hurt more as we aged. Something along those lines could also be beneficial because we have that belief, but is it really necessarily true? And is it really true to the extent that we think it is? Or is it just the story that we've heard from everybody else, or the general expectation that people have had of their bodies from past experiences? But now that we know what we know medically, nutritionally, whatever, may we be able to avoid that to some degree? So getting rid of
Yeah,
that absolute belief that that's the case
yeah,
could
and I was
be
saying, I
quite
mean,
beneficial.
I can say, you know, these are thoughts that are firing off over a dozen times a day. So just, you know, either angle, you know, reducing the long-term sort of self-fulfilling prophecy version, but then also just to just not have the crappy negative thought, you know, like once an hour over and over and over as I'm going through my day.
Right, right. And you know, like there's another one that was coming up too. I had the belief that I would lose my mobility.
Yeah, I'm writing these
Yeah,
down as we
yeah.
go.
So, you know, those are just some kind of off the top of my head about like the beliefs you have about the knees at this point.
Yep.
Um, I would also, if those thoughts kind of have a strong emotion, like that feeling of if you lose mobility, then you'd lose your freedom. And then what? You know, like it's just this, I think it's a fear of if this pain continues, I won't have the mobility and freedom that I normally have. And that would really upset my life plan. And so just kind of using the click track to have a fit about all of that.
Yeah, and to that point, like there, as I have the experience in everyday life, it goes to an irrational, right? So not rational and not irrational, just irrational lack of rationality. It goes to an irrational place that is sort of that too much water for the teacup emotional response, right? So out of threshold into emotional overwhelm place of just having that emotional reaction of sort of something, right? It's not a specific thought about you know, lack of mobility in regards to this or that or whatever. It's just quality of life, right? Like what is the quality of life if I don't have mobility in the sense of, you know, being able to, you know, walk or stand for more than, you know, an hour or two a day. And so very quickly it goes from sort of the thought process and the, okay, this is the recurring thought and the broken record, to boom, straight into emotional overwhelm of basically being kind of, you know, emotionally triggered about it.
Yeah, I think that I would probably then start with that emotion. Just you start out telling yourself the story of, if I lose mobility, then, would really upset my quality of life, and kind of think about some examples of what that would mean to you, and let that anxiety come up about that as strongly as you can, and feel that while you do the click track. And if you have had experiences in the past where lack of mobility or pain has limited you before and had negative outcomes, then include those while you're doing that. And then I would go into those few beliefs that we were talking about to do that.
Yep.
But
And
go ahead.
okay, so in terms of like the super granular implementation, and you referred back to this when you were talking about your own experience with Restless Legs a little bit. So sitting there, doing the modality, and concentrating on the emotion, for like using like click track 2, right? Focusing on the emotion, right? I'm good with that. Very experienced there. In terms of using like belief blasters on a mental belief, right? Good there. The notion of when to focus on physical symptoms in addition, in conjunction, in lieu of, that's the part where this is sort of, new waters for me.
Okay. Yep. So I would just probably wait for a time when you're actually experiencing the physical pain.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe go for a walk, or, create the pain
Yeah.
to a pretty strong degree, and then use the click track once it's there, and continue kind of moving around a little bit, kind of exacerbating it while you do the click track, feeling that pain. Um, you could also very well acknowledge how this feeling has been with you to some degree since middle school. So, kind of replaying some of the past times that you have felt that pain or something similar to it throughout your history.
Yeah, and I would say there are 2 or 3 life moments that come to mind immediately. So
Yeah. And then also including a little bit of, similar to the other round, where you're like, what if this never goes away? What if I'm stuck with this pain forever?
right, right.
So it's kind of going through that whole past, present, future element of, feeling that pain, acknowledging where it's been in your past, acknowledging how you feel about that being in your future, and just keep going with that until you notice the pain decreasing.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah. So that's what I would do with that. Now, I also feel like it would be a good idea to dig a little deeper, to look at what might be behind all of this pain, because I don't think that it was a belief that your knees were bad that started the problem in the first place.
Right.
I mean, you had some physical injuries, and sometimes that happens in life, and it might not have like some big emotional meaning behind it. We have physical things happen to us. If you ask Louise Hay, a lot of times we attract injuries to ourselves to bring awareness to an area of our body that represents an emotional thing. So, kind of in a convoluted way,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes, and my example is the car accident that I had that bent my knee backwards in 2014. Um, I was really being stubborn, and like pushing and pushing and pushing, and like trying really hard. I think at that time it was fame. I was like really driving hard toward the fame, and being stubborn, um, trying to move toward that, and having that as like a huge focus at that point. And the car accident happened on the way to a speaking event in New York City.
I
So,
remember.
so I think that there was, and I still did the speaking engagement, but I was in a
Not stubborn at
wheelchair.
all, my friend.
So the knees represent stubbornness and kind of being stuck in what we think we're supposed to be focused on. And so, I know that you have a similar stubborn streak to what I've
Yeah.
had.
Yes.
And you really stick with something for as long as you possibly can to try to make it work, even when it doesn't feel right in your soul. You're just hoping maybe if I just tinker with it a little bit over here, maybe it'll finally click. And so I think that probably you may have had that going on even in middle school, some level of stubbornness, or being stuck in your ways, or kind of stuck in the muck to some
Yep.
degree. And that may have been why it was your knees that kept getting damaged. Because when you're doing sports, yeah, knees are a big one that get damaged, but other things can get hurt too. And so the fact that it was your knees over and over again can often be a signal to pay attention to ego and stubbornness, because that's really what the knees are supposed to represent.
Yeah, and the stubbornness, I mean, we're both kind of chuckling about it. The stubbornness definitely comes into play. I mean, it's like a third of my academic career, a third of my personal career. I mean, certainly a recurring theme, to say the least.
So, really digging in and looking at that, I think maybe starting with beating yourself up for the stubbornness, for the being stuck in the muck, and forcing yourself to follow through with things that really weren't feeding your soul, your your purpose, uh, and just using the click track to kind of tell yourself off, or be mad at yourself, or whatever, be frustrated with yourself for continuing to do things that really weren't serving you, because you were hoping that they might pay off. You were hoping that they would eventually do what you thought they would do. And um, so starting there, and you could go back as far as possible with that, of course, to where you may have been stubborn as a kid, as a middle schooler, whatever you can come up with, where you have examples of having been pushing yourself to go after things that really didn't feed you.
Yeah. I, I'm familiar with the benefit of sort of going to the origin memory. Um, I I don't know off the top of my head what would have been super stubborn of me in middle school per
Hmm.
se, but I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah. And
in terms of present day though, it's still a recurring theme in terms of uh, current reality with a couple of projects that are going on.
yeah, absolutely. And so, starting with that as the base emotion, and, to bring up that feeling as strongly as you can, that's a great
Yeah,
place to start, because that's where it's going to be most intense. But, I would say that probably like middle school, I would imagine that it would have to do with having to do well in school, even if you weren't really interested in it, because that's what we were supposed to do. So forcing yourself to maybe do a sport that you didn't love, or do a musical instrument you didn't love, or work really hard in school to please other people, even when it wasn't something that fed your soul. And not that those things aren't beneficial in some way, just like doing a job, or trying to make money, or trying to create something in your business, it can be a positive thing, and it has so far helped you survive. But as far as, has it fed your soul, has it led to great success, as much as really following your soul's passion would be, well, that kind of remains to be seen. So, so those kind of things can be, what sorts of routes you might look for.
Mm-hmm.
And often, even if you don't have a clear memory of specific things that you were sort of stubborn about in a similar way, sometimes during the track, your brain will just show you those memories and they'll just come to you out of the blue. Or sometimes you can just logically assume that because you have been as stubborn as you have been as an adult, you were probably like that as a kid too. So it can be as easy sometimes as just acknowledging that, like, this is always who I've been. And I've always just pushed and pushed, even when it didn't necessarily feel right. And so,
Yeah, and right there you mentioned a thing that has been a recurring theme for each of us using PS Tech. We talked about it. The notion of once you start the process, frequently the next layer of the onion will be revealed. Sometimes as frequently as mid-session, you start doing one thing, and then like 2-3 minutes in, you're like, oh wait, this is the real issue that just got revealed to me already. And so the notion of me sitting here looking at the piece of paper I'm taking notes on and looking at origin in middle school with 3 question marks and saying, I don't have a memory that I would immediately click track. That's not necessarily the whole sort of story or whatever. And just by sort of seat in chair, start the process, and then see what comes up via doing the modality to then see if there's a rabbit hole that emerges to then do another session on, is something that would be potentially relevant for this instant. Because for part of this, I'm sort of drawing a blank, and I see how it's relevant in present conditions, but not the historic ones. But that may just be my sort of own blinders until I zap it and see what happens.
right. Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, there is something to be said for just clearing the present situation and seeing where it goes.
Yeah.
But I've seen things clear way more easily if you go back as far as you can into the situation. So, yeah, definitely something to keep in mind there. Um, and I think that's really where I would start with this. I would imagine that there's probably more layers and areas to this that we could dig into, but off the top of my head, that's what's really coming up. Do you feel up to maybe doing a round or two on the show so that we can see a little bit of clearing while you're here?
Yeah, absolutely. We have like a dozen things that you just rattled off and I wrote down. I would say doing 2 sessions, one on the actual physical sensation of knee pain to see if we can whack-a-mole that and see if it feels any different at all. And then
So you're
one of,
currently experiencing the knee
yeah,
pain right now. Okay.
oh, yeah. And then one of the sort of, I'll say, more traditional aspects of um, emotion and origin and all of that. So I'd
Yeah,
say let's do one of each.
absolutely. That sounds great. Okay. So we will be right back after we have done 2 rounds with David on his knee pain. All right, we are back after David's done a couple of rounds, and I think round 1 was about the physical pain, and round 2 was more about what if I lose quality of life from this pain. So, uh, David, when you started, what was the pain rating physically for your knees at that time?
5 to 6.
Okay. And if you were to feel your knees now, like tune into the pain level, has it gone down at all?
Yeah, I would say it's down to 3.5.
Great.
There were 2 specific spots on my legs, um, and the first one started easing up pretty quickly. And because I'm a little bit of a skeptic, I was sitting in a different position. I was sort of sitting back in the chair more, sort of adjusted myself, did the session, and the spot sort of high up on my left knee dissipated pretty quickly. There's another spot on my right leg that was more persistent and lasted through most of the session, and then sort of at the end started giving way a little bit. But then throughout the second session, it stayed sort of more relaxed. So that's sort of more, it took like the entire session for it to start to release, but then it stayed a little bit relaxed. So I
Yeah.
consider that a result.
Yeah, I would probably do another round or two of that, in the near future and see where that gets you as far as longer term results.
Yeah, and I'm just, I have some travel coming up at the end of the month, and it involves being in a plane and flying cross country. I'm going to Vegas for work, and just the notion of if I'm having the emotional sort of freak out before I get on the plane, that I know works. But in terms of after getting off the plane, if I'm in pain and worried about hopping in a rental car and, zipping around town, doing what I got to do for work, taking 10 minutes just to reduce it from, 5.5 to 3.5, that's worth 10 minutes to me. So.
Absolutely. That's great. Good. Okay, so with the second round, at its most intense, what number would you say it got to while you were doing that round with the fear of losing the quality of life and the mobility and stuff?
I'd put that at an 8. Very early on in the session, I was able to sort of bring up sort of that emotional wellspring of just sadness more than anything else. Just that sort of notion of, I don't know what the impact would be, but anything regarding quality of life, and the loss of mobility, just, that notion of sadness orientated to that stuff. So yeah, I put that at an 8.
And what would you say now? Like, what number would you give it at this point?
A 2. And that
Wow.
that jump from an 8 to a 2 is very common for me using Click Track 2 for things. I mean, going back like 3 years, that's sort of my average sweet spot. It's hard for me to get it up to, a 9 or a 10 in the moment. If I'm scheduling the session, it's hard for me to get the emotional threshold above that.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
then, yeah, it almost never goes to 0 on one pass for me. To be blunt, considering the magnitude of this issue and the fact that it was a little less specified, right? It wasn't one specific thing. It was more, as we said, quality of life and just sort of having a freak out, sort of I think you refer to it as a temper tantrum
Mm-hmm.
for
Yep.
how you treat it. Because that isn't super specific, I'm always a little leery of how well that'll work. So I'm a little surprised it went from an 8 to a 2. But yeah, the notion of, just it not being triggering, right? The emotion doesn't sort of turn into that kind of, there's no emotional avalanche. It's all of the real world logistical things may happen in terms of, potential loss of mobility or increased discomfort when driving or flying. And so what? And life goes on. It isn't something that triggers that negative emotional response. And it's interesting, off recording, you and I spoke for a little bit about whether or not I'd include sort of past experiences in that freak out. And I didn't even get to them, right? It was really just, sort of quality of life, right? I try and pay attention to what my sort of inner monologue is as I'm doing these. And for the first one, it was pretty much just literally thinking the word pain, 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 and concentrating on the spot on my body. And then for this one, for the second one, it was really just, loss of mobility and impact on travel, just because that was sort of the visualization and it's relevant for, what's happening in 2 weeks in my life. But I didn't even get into significant past experiences. And so there's
Yeah,
clearly another, couple rounds worth of material from our initial list and what we were talking about, for me to go, do that as well. But
yeah,
yeah,
it'll be interesting to see what shifts once you include that stuff in those rounds too. If that changes things as well or gets you a little bit more longer term relief from things. So yeah, that's awesome. I'm glad you were able to get that kind of relief on those two things that quickly. Uh,
yeah. And so I'm sitting here sort of a little surprised, and sort of from our previous conversation, I was thinking this would be kind of more of a jumbled mess of interwoven things. I thought this was going to sort of take, cutting away at this from a couple different spots. And the fact that the second topic, quality of life, and sort of freaking out about it, the fact that that is sort of a standalone, non-bundled, isolated thing got that much traction in one whack. I am pleasantly surprised by.
that's great. Awesome. Yeah, and I love it when, we're not expecting a massive shift and then, oh, there it is.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. Good. So what I would suggest is that we meet up in a week or two, and I think we may have already set up that date to do that.
I believe
Uh,
so.
and then just in between now and then, using the click track to do a couple more rounds like we just talked about, where you focus on what you've already focused on and then add in some of those past elements and what if it continues into the future and back and forth between those things. And then the beliefs that we talked about, like the belief that you have bad knees, the belief that your body deteriorates as you age, the belief that you'd lose mobility.
Yeah, absolutely.
So working on those in between, and then we will get back together and review, what shifts you've seen, whether physically or emotionally, uh, between now and then.
Sounds perfect.
Awesome. Well, thank you for coming on, and I look forward to talking to you soon.
Thank you for having me. Absolutely.